All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pain as we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Ricky, today is Friday, April 19th. We are back after a bit of a break. We are going to be joined on today's episode by Dr. Eugene Beresin, who is a professor of psychiatry. We'll get into his bio when he comes on. He is tremendously accomplished, and we're so excited to talk to him. And normally, Ricky, when we've had a couple weeks off, I am breathing down your neck, being like, "Let's go. We gotta get going and get back on." But I haven't been over these past few weeks because, as of a week ago, you are a new father. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I'm a dad, and I guess let that be a lesson to anybody else who made a commitment to Brendan. Have a kid, and he'll let you get out of it.
I'm sure there are plenty of people in my life who maybe would debate that. But tell us how it's been a week now. How's the first week of dad life been? Girl dad life been?
Girl dad, it has been amazing. So she was born on April 12th, exactly a week ago today, actually, before we continue, is my mom's birthday. So shout out to my mom. Um, but it has
It's
been
also it's also Katie's birthday, so shout out to her too. Yeah.
shout out to Katie. Huh,
Yeah.
interesting. A lot of April birthdays.
We love it.
We do love them. Uh, and it is, well, as you know, I can be, I use a lot of words, some of them in run-on sentences, but the one thing that has definitely been going on is the lack of sleep. Not because of my daughter. She's wonderful, but she's growing, and growing girls need to eat, and when she needs to eat, she lets me know. And so between Ginny and I, there's not a ton of sleep, and my mental state uh is taxed, but it's been otherwise it's been incredible. She's uh well, right now she's kind of a potato. She just sort of
Yeah.
eats and sleeps and poops. But she's beautiful and healthy, and um yeah, I can't wait to get to know her more. And
Yeah.
we recently introduced her to our dog, which was a big step. We let Winnie give her a nice kiss on the face, and so far she seems unbothered. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's been good. It's been a whirlwind. It still does not feel real. I still find myself like being like,
Yeah.
I think there's an adult somewhere. I wrote on her birth certificate that like I'm the father of this child, and I was like, no, 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 this doesn't feel. I need somebody who has better qualifications than me should be here.
Yeah.
Who's my guardian?
Sure. Sure. No, I mean that all makes sense. But so happy for you and Jenny, who, if you got our newsletter, we wrote that she's the real MVP here, and just
100%.
so thrilled that yeah, that everyone is healthy and happy and great. Your daughter has a great head of hair. She's looking great for a week old. So yeah, it's super exciting. I know I can't even begin to you know understand how exciting it is for you and Jenny, but even just from my perspective, it's so exciting for you guys to be new parents, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it. I think that's going to be one of the fun things about doing this podcast is all of our intros where we kind of reflect on our weeks, and now so much is going to be you reflecting on like life as a parent of a growing young girl, and I think that'll be really fun.
Yeah. No, we'll definitely have to get into that. Get into sort of the mental health aspects of parenthood as well, which is
Yeah.
good for today's segment.
Well, this worked out very well in that I think this is a perfect kind of welcome back episode for you and so many of our friends at this point in our lives, Ricky, are having children or have children that are young, and So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be welcoming Dr. Eugene Beresin on shortly. He's a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. When he comes on, I'll give a more extended bio, but he's going to talk a lot about mental health amongst young people and this epidemic of loneliness that has grown in the last few years. This, Ricky, we talked a lot about it post-COVID, and the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, came out with an advisory about a year ago that said that this is like a serious problem, not only like a mental health problem, but it affects physical health too. And it, Dr. Beresin is one of the like leading experts in working with young people in their mental health in particular, but in just in this space in general. And so we're thrilled that he's agreed to come on and give us so much of his time. Before we welcome him on, a quick reminder, everyone, the podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. You know, they've been building handcrafted, high-end custom tables and desks in Boston 2018. That's Cannon with two N's. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. The founder, Zach Hardoon, one of his favorite lines is, the best way to avoid loneliness is to have good conversations around a quality handmade piece of furniture.
He would say that.
Have those conversations around any piece of furniture, but there's no better furniture than the high-end handcrafted pieces that the guys over at Cannon Hill Wood make. So check them out if you go over there. Let them know that we sent you. And without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Beresin. All right, we are now thrilled to welcome Dr. Eugene Beresin to the program. Dr. Beresin is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He received his undergrad from Princeton and his Master of Arts in Philosophy and his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. He has served as the director of child and adolescent psychiatry residency training program at Mass General Hospital and McLean Hospital from 1985 to 2013. Dr. Beresin is currently the executive director of the new Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds, which is devoted to promoting the emotional and behavioral well-being of young people by providing innovative education about mental health for parents, those who work with youth and young adults, and for young people themselves. So we'll get into that a lot in our conversation. Dr. Beresin is also a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, a Distinguished Fellow of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. He has served as a president of the American Associations of Directors of Psychiatry Residency Training and president of the American College of Psychiatrists. His book, Music, in the series Arts for Health, was released in 2022, and his book, Helping Your Lonely Teen, was published just last month. So that is a very short overview of a very impressive bio from Dr. Beresin, and we're thrilled that he is joining us today.
Right. Thank you very much. Just call me Gene.
We'll try. I no promises on that one. But so Gene, like that's obviously your professional bio. If people look you up online, that's what they'll get. And I think a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of loneliness in general and young people seems recent, but you've been in this field now for close to 40 years. So can you talk a little bit about why originally you were drawn to this field?
Oh, well, it wasn't because of loneliness. Although I tell you, child and adolescent psychiatrists, like pediatricians, we're a small knit group of people. We're never lonely. And as a matter of fact, I've been in we have a band of child psychiatrists that has been going on for 20 years. So that it's called Pink Floyd and the Transitional Objects. Right. So we're it wasn't loneliness, but I went to Penn, and I was it was during the 60s and 70s, and I was very active against the war in Vietnam and civil rights, and not against civil rights, but working towards civil rights and women's liberation. And it's interesting. Princeton was very big on anti-war movement, given that we had the Institute for Defense Analysis, and we also were nearby with Fort Dix. So it harkened me back to kind of ninth grade when I got suspended from school for sending SNCC buttons That's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But Yale was big on working with the Black Panthers and working towards uh, civil rights. And we had lots of friends there. I decided to go to medical school, even though I was a music major, and uh, because I just thought it was. Well, we have for them, my family is filled with doctors, and I just kind of like the idea. When I got there, I was completely disillusioned. Um, in terms of a gentleman's disagreement, I mean, people didn't talk about politics, people didn't talk about current events, people were competitive, and I was playing with the sitarist uh, in a uh, uh, in this club, which was in the basement of the Christian Association at Penn, and he said, "Well, come on in philosophy," and I said, "Geez, I mean, I've only taken two philosophy courses, and one was Kaufman's Hegel, and one was Marxist aesthetics." And he said, "That's fine." He said, "You'll get in." So it turns out that I went to my dean and I said, "Look, I'm leaving. I'm just going to do philosophy." And he said, "No, don't worry about that. We'll put you in an MD PhD program and just do anything relevant towards medicine," which actually was I'm so lucky uh, to have that. I mean, not only was it debt free, um, but it also gave me the opportunity to really use philosophy and then it turns out that I had to kind of like do a language requirement, stay an extra year and teach and I just wanted to work with people. So I went back to medical school and loved pediatrics and loved working with kids and I matched into pediatrics. But then I also, made a U-turn because it turns out that this was before the days when you matched into psychiatry. So I made an agreement with the training director at Mass General that I would come to psychiatry when I was done with pediatrics. And he said, fine, well, just give me 3 or 4 months notice. And it, I realized in my first year that what I really was interested in was the kind of social, emotional, behavioral aspects of kids and their families. And with the help of a great mentor, Al Solnit, who was a pediatrician and an analyst, and he said, "Well, do you want to treat ear infections and asthma, or do you want to do family therapy?" And I said, "Are you kidding me?" He said, "Well, then get out of here." So I did. I left after a year and went to Mass General and always wanted to be a teacher, always wanted to be a training director, and had the opportunity to do that and started the child and adolescent psychiatry training program in 1985. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. But it seemed that our field, which I just love, is just inadequate in terms of what we're doing in terms of society and public mental health. And I was fortunate enough to get a founding gift from the Clay family to start the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds. So in 2013, I stepped down as training director and uh, started the Clay Center. And since then, it's been an incredible experience, just writing for the public and doing blogs. And we have our own podcast called Shrinking It Down, Mental Health Made Simple. Um, as a musician, I get to do all the soundtracks for our videos. We have a YouTube channel, so it's pretty cool. So that's it in a nutshell. That's why I'm here. And about loneliness, the reason why loneliness came up is because the Surgeon General wrote an advisory last May of 2023, and almost a year ago, noting that we really do have an epidemic of loneliness. And interestingly, in most societies, including ours, the elderly are typically the loneliest. I mean, with the loss of partners and friends uh, and such. But it turns out that the loneliest the loneliest segment of our population are the Gen Zs, 12 to 26, which was kind of surprising to most people. And the Surgeon General went back, and this trend isn't. Most people say, "Oh, it was just COVID, the lockdown." Well, yeah, people were lonely during COVID, but if you look at this report, he the the incidence of loneliness has been steadily rising since 1976. I mean, it's not as though this is unheard of. Um, uh, so it's been increasing, and what we're struggling with in the field is to figure out why are young people so lonely, uh, and why has it been increasing over time?
So I'm sure this is exactly what we would love to delve into. I think you started off saying that youth mental health services for youth are sort of you summarized it as inadequate. I'm curious, given how advanced our medical services are in general, where are the deficiencies in the mental health aspect of it, and kind of what are some of the leading theories for you in terms of why we're seeing this rise in loneliness among youth?
Well, they're two separate questions. We do have, I mean, overall, uh, the incidence of depression, anxiety, stress, loneliness, and suicide has been skyrocketing among young people. And not just the Gen Zs, I mean, but even younger. Uh, uh, eh, there are only 8,000 child and adolescent psychiatrists in the whole country to kind of care for about 14 to 20 million young people. And there's probably about 4,000 child psychologists. Couple that with about 120,000 clinical social workers, many of whom are embedded in schools. Even if we're liberal about our numbers and we say, okay, so let's say we've got, you know, uh, 100,000 social workers, which we don't, but 13,000 child psychologists for, 20 million young people. I mean, so, try to get an appointment with a therapist, and it's virtually impossible without a long wait. So one whole issue is taking care of people. But the other issue of loneliness is a different matter. And although loneliness can cause and has been demonstrated to cause anxiety, depression, stress, misuse of substances, and and also some medical problems, heart disease, diabetes, weakened immune system in older people, premature death. So it's a serious matter. I mean, we human beings are pack animals. I mean, we need each other. And question is, why? Why has this population become so lonely? And I think uh, the various reasons have been, well, the low-hanging fruit that most people say is that it's just it's social media because they're disconnected. They're not talking face to face. They're using screens, and you can't really be with another person when you're online all the time. Plus, there's fear of missing out. You know, there's cyberbullying. There's all kinds of dissing and defriending and all kinds of sketchy stuff that happens on social media. So that's the answer. I don't agree. I think that's part of the picture. Uh, but there are a lot of benefits of social media too. So, you know, kids and adults who are like, if we didn't have digital media during the pandemic, we really would be disconnected. And for kids that are shy or that have various forms of autism or that social anxiety, uh, the screen is a good way of stepping in. I think there are other reasons. And I think among the Gen Z population, one major factor is being overscheduled. I mean, I don't know about you guys going to school, but when I was in school, we didn't have to take honors and AP courses and then play 3 sports a year and do community service and do an internship and play an instrument and be in extracurriculars. And I mean, the kids right now, young people right now are booked 24/7, 7 days a week. They're completely overscheduled and they don't have the time to just hang out and process. And adolescents and young adults need to process their experience. So compared to Finland, that only has 3.5 hours of academics and virtually no homework, and has some of the highest s- academic records in the world. The rest of their time is spent doing social activities together, whether they're playful or whether they're projects that are useful for learning. Uh, it's we're really overtaxing our kids, and I think that's another reason. And I think a third reason, which is particularly true of the Gen Zs, is that they're very concerned about this world that they're inheriting. I mean, marginalized people, um, uh, discrepancies, particularly and disparities, with for people of color, for LGBTQIA plus youth, for immigrants, concerns about mass shootings, uh, gun control, sexual assaults, hashtag, never again, hashtag me too, climate change, you know, I mean, look what they're getting. Economic downturn. I mean, it's not it's not a pretty picture. And they're very, very sensitive to these issues. And I think it's another factor that causes loneliness and separation. And uh, what you mentioned earlier, Brendan, in terms of a gentleman's disagreement. I mean, look at the polarization of our country. I mean, we can't even talk with each other. If we have different points of view, I mean, I have some patients, young adults and kids who are very conservative, and they can't speak their mind. They can't because it's not cool, particularly on college campuses that tend to be more liberal and progressive. They get wiped out, completely wiped out. And the same thing is true for those on the left, on the left. They feel, disparaged by, the leadership in this country, and they don't feel that they're being represented. And so we're not having civil conversations. We're not having adequate conflict resolution, which doesn't mean we all, hold hands and put our arms around each other and sing Kumbaya and go off into the sunset. It means we agree to disagree and we can love and respect each other no matter what, just like you two.
Yeah,
That's what we're trying to do here.
yeah, exactly. I think that third point is really interesting. Maybe before we move on to it, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the second point, which is this idea of the kind of overscheduling. Are you seeing this play out, this epidemic of loneliness play out differently in different communities? Obviously when I think of
Yeah.
the triple AP plus after school sports and whatever debate club, that's kind of Brendan and I's upbringing, which is a very kind of private school or wealthy suburban high school, whereas some other places that don't have as many opportunities, but maybe have a different kind of structure around it. Do you see that in play out kind of differently across different communities?
Oh, of course. But it's hard to generalize, but I mean, 60% of young people go to college. So what about the other 40%? You know, well, they're also overscheduled and burdened. I mean, whether they're helping their families, whether they're out there getting a job to contribute, whether they're helping to take care of siblings, you know, eh, eh, you know, uh, there are many stresses and burdens. I mean, uh, being poor is not easy. In fact, in terms of being lonely, I mean, these kids are lonely for different reasons. They're either overscheduled because they're working their tails off to help support the family and their siblings and to help pay the rent, um, or they're lonely because they don't have the means to have a mission. I mean, young people want to do something that's valuable for themselves and for their communities. And if, let's face it, if you've got the means, if you've got money, or if you've got opportunities, you can do something. And that's not to say that people who are indigent don't have opportunities, but it's not on the front burner, oftentimes. And uh, uh, you know, for a, kind of a rich suburban kid to get an internship, they're connections. But what if you're indigent, or in an underserved community, and you don't have the connections and you can't get those things? What do you do?
All right. I think I I really liked Ricky's question because I think in some ways we're talking about different forms of loneliness. So if we're talking to the more privileged people, and Ricky and I would count ourselves growing up in that class, and Ricky and I were very busy growing up. But I think I like being busy. You know, you went from school to baseball practice to, like newspaper or yearbook or debate or Model UN, and then you went home and you did homework. And for those set of families and kids, a lot of like my connections, reasons why I'm still friends with so many of these people are because I played sports with them or I did clubs with them. Like, so as people, I'm just curious, as you're overbooking people, a lot of those like overbooking things seem like social interactions, like you're being part of a team or part of a club. Like, how do you kind of reconcile those competing things of, I don't want you to be so busy that you have no time to process things and to decompress and to just be a kid, versus like this is where you get social connection, versus I don't want you just sitting in your room on your phone all day. Go out there and play a sport.
It depends on the coach, and it depends on the parents. I mean, I've seen so many suburban parents, and parents of college students, uh, 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 provide terrible role models for their kids. I mean, they're not. Well, my second daughter played field hockey for UMass, which is a D1 school, and she played for Acton Boxborough that won the states. And I could tell you, the worst offenders of having fun and learning together and sharing together and working together as a team were the parents. They were awful. I mean, they were screaming and yelling. They were cursing out the refs. They were, I mean, so it really depends on how a coach uh helps a team have fun together. I mean, I don't know how competitive your sports were. Well, Roxbury Latin. It was Roxbury Latin, right?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty competitive. I mean, so if you've got a good enough coach that allows you to not just kind of like you know, play rigorously and learn skills rigorously, but also kind of have some fun together and socialize together. You know, most of the time in competitive sports, uh, regardless of the school you go to, you're scrimmaging or you're playing against another team, and then you're rushing off to someplace else. You're not hanging out after the game. I mean, how often did you hang out after the game with your friends? Go have a pizza. You went home, you ran home and you did your homework.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to, as someone, so it's not only like reflecting on our past experiences, but I taught middle school here in Boston, in Dorchester, East Boston for years. I still coach the debate team over there. So I'm just trying, and I was very much of the ethos, like be busy. Busy is good. I like this idea of greed is good in some ways. It feels like when I'm saying this, but like I wanted my kids to be involved in extracurriculars, and because my philosophy was like, if you go home, what are you really doing? Like I know what you're doing. You're on Instagram, you're on Snapchat, you're on TikTok, or you're sitting in front of the TV. I'd rather you be playing flag football. I'd rather you be out here at this debate club. So, but then I'm hearing you say that there are obviously kind of, you go too far in that and too. So I'm just trying to think, like, if you're
Yeah.
giving advice for people that are working with young people or are parents of young people in this generation, like how do you go about navigating this world that seems damned if you do, damned if you don't?
Well, I think this is where social, like where digital media is misused. Um, if you go home, first of all, it's rare that you can go home with your friends because everybody's got busy schedules. But let's say that you and your friends go home after you're playing some sports. Um, uh, if you're sitting watching the screen or and oftentimes using your phone and looking at TikTok or Instagram or whatever, and at the screen at the same time watching a series, you know, uh, it, it's very different than if you just put the phones down and took a walk in the woods, or if you played a game together. I don't mean a video game necessarily, uh, but a board game, or did some creative arts. I mean, played in a band, played music together, just hung out. I mean, it seems to me that the amount of time that our kids have to just relax and hang out and talk with each other without the screens. And that's where I come down on excessive use of screens, is that if it takes the place of face-to-face contact, of discussion, of doing things together, of journaling together, of drawing together, of going out in the woods together, whatever. Um, I think it's missing an opportunity to really learn about relationships and about how to kind of um, interact socially. So, the screen can't teach you how to interact socially.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, of finding space to get people together in unstructured time. That's something where I'm like, oh, that seems actionable and also seems reasonable. And Ricky and I, as busy as we were in middle school and high school, did have plenty of that time too. But we grew up in a different time, to be fair. All right, so I have one other question before I'll let Ricky get back in here. As we're seeing this generation, as you say, there's more anxiety, more depression. In some ways, in having worked with young people for a long time, I would say I don't envy these kids. I don't know that there's ever been a harder time to grow up than these kids are growing up in. So with all that said, now I'll do my like old man yelling at the clouds type thing of when Ricky and I were growing up, and we are not that much older than these kids, we're mid-30s, mental health wasn't even really talked about. Like and it wasn't like socio-emotional learning. Those weren't things that people cared about. It was like, oh, like you're sad, figure it out. Like this is like work harder, do better. Like this was it. And I know this is probably every generation is saying like the next generation is softer than they were. I get all that, but it just seems to me like your point is well taken from the beginning, is that we don't have the resources to give kids the mental health support that they need. But I don't know that we had those resources a generation ago. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how much is this like a cause and effect thing? Like the more that you talk about mental health, the more everyone says, oh, I have mental health issues. Or like that, and versus these mental health issues are finally being fleshed out, of like these things
Well,
always existed
it,
and now we're just finally giving them attention.
they always existed and they're increasing. And if you look at the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is 20,000 ninth through 12th graders, that's done every 2 years, um, the numbers show, first of all, that about 20% of young people seriously considered suicide. I don't, not just thinking about suicide, but seriously consider it. Um, Anywhere from 8 to 10% of kids actually make attempts. And the numbers are increasing in terms of suicide, depression, anxiety. What's different now, and this is the silver lining, is that uh, a decade ago and more, we didn't talk about it. Uh, the stigma of having a quote psychiatric disorder was so awful that no parent or kid wanted to admit to it. The good news now is that we are putting it out there, that people are talking about it, that they are addressing the issues. Um, and uh, e- e- Even though the numbers are increasing, the conversation is increasing as well. And the stigma of is diminished. You know, it turns out that about at any point in time, about 1 in 4 individuals across the lifespan um, will have a psychiatric disorder of some kind. Uh, and it during a lifetime, at any one point, it's 1 in 4, and during the lifetime, it's 1 in 2. It's more common than strep throat. More common than strep throat. Uh, Now, that includes, if people say, what? Well, if you include anxiety, depression, substance abuse or misuse, um, uh, uh, Alzheimer's, you know, uh, the whole range, learning disabilities. As a teacher, you've seen it, with ADHD, slow processing speed, dyslexia. It's huge. And interestingly and importantly, 50% begin before age 14 and 75% begin before age 26. So if you look at the Gen Zs, 12 to 26, 75% of that huge number of psychiatric disorders will have begun. And the good news now is that we're talking about it. Now, what are we doing about it? That's another whole issue. And there are lots of things we can do, even with the shortage of providers. But it's in a sense come out of the closet. And I think it was the silver lining of the pandemic because a lot of people were depressed and upset and misused substances and reached for the carbs and were miserable. And then they were saying, well, geez, look at what our kids are missing. They're missing social interaction. They're missing social emotional learning. Well, I knew about social emotional learning for 30 years. And if you look at Castle, which is the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. They've been around for a really long time. But only after the pandemic did parents and teachers and administrators start saying, hey, we got some serious mental health problems. And we've got some serious and social emotional learning programs in schools have been shown to increase academic performance, not just increase, behavior, but uh, it it does improve behavior and leadership and inclusion and sharing and empathy and collaborative decision making and academic performance. And so that's the silver lining of COVID. Uh, I think it's always been there, but it's been increasing.
I, I think something that has also come out, or at least feels amplified after COVID, is kind of this idea of sort of structuring the classroom based on what state you're in the prevailing politics. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your work in the sort of the space of resilience, given that, as you said, if you're a conservative kid on a really liberal campus, you may be it may be difficult for you to feel like your opinions are valued or that they matter, and vice versa, and depending on where your employment is, right? You may be a liberal person in a very conservative world. How um how is how is that potentially an area of focus that we can have, or is it not? And we do need to rethink the way that we're doing some teaching, or as Brendan
I,
said, sort of structuring
I
unstructured times.
I think without getting political, which I tend to do, but without getting political.
Feel free. Feel free. Yeah.
I mean, eh, I have never seen our country or the world so marginalized and siloed. I have never seen this kind of of isolationism, whether it's nationalism, whether you're a white separatist or a born again evangelist, or whether you are a flaming liberal, or as Bernie Sanders is, as a democratic socialist. You know, it, 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 the polarities are so stark and so vitriolic. They're so hostile towards each other. I remember when I was growing up, and this speaks to my age. I would love to watch the debates. Speaking of debating, of William F. Buckley versus Gore Vidal, and w- you know, and I loved watching that. I hated William F. Buckley because he was so damn smart and so spot on with his point of view. I mean, he could really articulate the rationale, the reasons, and he respected Gore Vidal, who was a flaming liberal, and yet it was civil. I mean, what's happened to civility? And this is not just a United States issue because we're seeing it all over the world. I mean, for example, and this will get political. You would think that the Israelis and the Palestinians would bond together. There they are in this teeny piece of land surrounded by hostile forces. I mean, let's face it, many of the Arab countries are not fans of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians and the Israelis have been conquered by numerous other groups. And you would think that they would bond together in their oppression the way the Jews and the Muslims did when they were expelled from Spain in 1492 and went to Morocco. I mean, and they lived in harmony. Uh, so it's not as though differences that are really quite stark, um, excuse me, uh, need to divide us. But in the current world, and I don't have the reasons for this. I don't really know the reasons for this, but the disparities between the super rich and the poor has never been greater. The amount of wealth and the misdistribution of wealth has never ever been greater. Now, that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you're fortunate enough to be super wealthy, great, you know, but pay your taxes like everybody else, right? I mean, you know, eh, 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 you know, uh, so, eh, but you can't even say that without some people, not either of you, but without some people saying or going on the attack. You know,
Yeah.
just the thought of something radical like that, um, is not, well, okay, but let's consider both sides of the issue. Let's consider both sides of tax breaks for the wealthy, and a little bit of equality in the tax structure. You know, we don't have these kinds of discussions. So I don't know if you guys have the answer of why the world has become so starkly polarized. It's not, I think it contributes to loneliness because I think what it does is
Yeah.
it makes the separatists, you know, uh, the socialists, the liberals, the libertarians, you name it, uh, uh, marginalized and siloed, and there's no meeting in the middle. And look at Congress. I mean, they can't get their act together. I mean,
We
they
talk about
can't.
it every week.
I mean, they can't they
Yeah.
can't they can't do they can't do anything together. I mean, why not?
Yeah,
I think that breeds loneliness. I think that does breed loneliness among everybody.
yeah,
Agreed.
and I think this goes back a bit to one of your earlier points, just the uh, maybe level of despair and hopelessness when it comes to our political system is one thing, but as you mentioned, climate change is another. Uh, rising debt and that sort of thing is another. Um, Kelly, Brennan and I have often talked about how this generation, the generation that's younger than us, is more aware than
Yeah.
ever about sort of the world around them in a way that most of my anxieties in high school were just related to me, how other people around me were perceiving me and whether I was cool or not cool. But these kids are worried about that and they're worried about the future. Um, yeah, and I mean, I guess if you're giving sort of practical advice for how folks of our age and who are kind of shaping some of the opportunities and the way that younger people receive information or whatever, what are the types of things that you would suggest to not to take for granted how much they know and how good it is that they're so well informed, but also to make sure that they're not getting sort of wallowing in this kind of hopelessness.
I totally agree. I mean, it's the there's greater social and global awareness now than I've seen since the 60s. Uh, and and yet the whole culture and way of managing it is quite different. Um, but I think there are a number of things that can be done. Uh, I think that social emotional learning curricula in schools and in the community can be extremely valuable. Um, being able to talk about various uh, uh, political points of view. I mean, we're you know we can introduce civics. It, civics used to be taught in secondary school. It's gone away. I think there's a role uh, that's very valuable for young people to be activists. And I think that activism among young people uh, for whatever cause is an incredible way of bonding, of expressing one's identity, of collaborating with others, of articulating points of view. I mean, if you're demonstrating and you're an activist, you better have your act together. You better be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing in an articulate way, or it's kind of pointless. But it does things together and it helps bond people together. Um, so I think that's another thing that can be done. And I think that we also need mentors. We, and whether it's coaches or clergy or attorneys or politicians or grandparents, I think giving young people a sense that we've been through hard times before and we can manage them again. Using narratives, for example, is super important. I mean, when I remember that my mom died when she was 102, and she was born in 1916, so she lived through the Great Depression. And my kids would always say to her, "Gamma, tell us about the Depression." Tell us about and she was a concert pianist and but she would play in her brother and sister went to college before her, so they went to Barnard and Columbia, and she was playing the piano in the department stores for change, okay, and then eventually paid her way through Hunter College, but uh, narratives about how we've gotten through rough times have somehow been lost. I mean, people are not telling the story. In every spiritual community, for example, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or you name it. They're based on narratives. They're based on meaning making. They're based on questions and answers, on kicking around ideas, and on telling stories that have meaning and relevance. Uh, and we're not telling stories anymore, right? We're not in narrative mode. We're in proclamation mode. We're in name calling mode. I mean, instead of using narratives, calling somebody some nasty name doesn't, you know, needs to change. But it's going to take folks like you guys, you know, and others to kind of demonstrate that this is not, uh, it's been done before. It's not out of line, and actually, everybody benefits from it.
Yeah, that I think that's a really nice way to leave it here. You've given us so much to think about. I hope the our listeners are similarly kind of inspired to consider these issues anew. And I think as someone, like I've said, I've referenced multiple times, as someone that works with this particular generation and has for a decade and a half at this point, like it's you've just given me a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate that from you. Ricky, as of a week ago, is a new father. I don't know if you have any advice for someone that's raising young children in this world, but feel free to share it if you do. Yeah.
Well, it's just great. I mean, it's interesting. It's when you have a new baby and you're first. It's like there was an absence, and now there's something, and it's kind of like an instant love affair. It's like it's an amazing experience. Um, but you know, uh, what advice would I give? I mean, parenting is a whole other ball of wax. But one of the things the Surgeon General did say that fosters resilience is making secure attachments. And I would say, pay attention to the attachment that you make with your child. And attachment means as your child grows, um, have reflective dialogue, have collaborative discourse. When you mess up, which you will as a parent, because as my favorite psychiatrist Donald Winnicott said, we succeed by our failures, and we only need to be good enough as parents. But when you get it wrong, apologize and correct uh, misunderstandings. All of those things lead to both secure attachments and to resilience and to the creation of a child that can actually both be alone and enjoy, and this is different than loneliness, that they
Yeah.
can enjoy solitude because they know that you are there even when you're not there. You know, uh, Winnicott said that the capacity to be alone is one of the greatest achievements uh, of life, and in fact, it's being alone, quote, in the presence of someone, so they always know that you're there, and that's a real gift, and it's something to look forward to in parenting. Um, and then your child will also have the ability to become resilient. And resilient isn't a trait that kids are born with. Resilience, it's a double-edged sword. It's the skill to prevent adversity on the one hand. This definition was taught to me by Chet Pierce, who was one of my mentors, who was he was the first African American football player for Harvard to play below the Mason-Dixon line. And the team boycotted the separate, um, you know, restaurants. He also worked in NASA for astronauts in isolation. In fact, there's a mountain named after him called Mount Pierce. Uh, at any rate, I digress. But when I told Chet that I was doing the Clay Center and we were gonna base it on resilience, he said, "Well, this is very, gee, that's just great. But resilience is a double-edged sword. One edge prevents adversity, and the other edge gives you the coping skills to kind of handle adversity when you're facing it. So uh, by helping to create solid, stable kids who have a good sense of themselves and know that you're there with them, they can learn the other what it takes to become resilient. So have fun.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. So if Dr. Beresin, for our listeners out there, you plugged briefly earlier your own podcast, and you've mentioned the Clay Center throughout. So where could people go if they
Well,
wanted to
well,
follow up on either you personally or some of the things that you
well,
have referenced?
well, the Clay Center is real simple. It's mghclaycenter.org. And we also have a YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube MGH Clay Center, that's where we have lots and lots of videos and podcasts and other things. And our podcast, Shrinking It Down, Mental Health Made Simple, is on, iTunes, Spotify, the usual suspects. It's on most places where podcasts are available. So uh, at this point in time, we have about 400, 450 blogs and um, lots and lots and lots of videos and podcasts for people to listen to and learn from and ask us questions. We're open to we want to be responsive to the needs of the public because we can't think of everything. No matter how experienced we are, there's always going to be something that hasn't occurred to us. I mean, for example, one of the podcasts that we just did was released last week. It was actually two residents. So proud of these guys, fellows in child and adolescent psychiatry, that talked about role playing and what role playing is, both in games, but also in terms of therapeutic role playing. And uh, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or Halloween or in a therapeutic modality like cognitive behavior therapy or collaborative problem solving, both of which are on our website. Um, it's a cool thing to do, and you can do it at home.
Yeah, what I think is so great about this conversation is I know we talked a lot about young people, but it's something for everybody. We talked about how like these issues kind of affect older people, and they affect people in middle age, and they affect younger people, and they affect people if you are a parent of a very young person or an adolescent, or like you have friends. It feels like you have resources for these issues that affect people across the spectrum of our society. And it's great that, like you said, that we're able to talk about this stuff so openly these days, and so much work to do, and to do better as families and friends and as society. But as I think we all are on the same page with, these conversations are a good step.
Yeah. Well, and I applaud your gentleman's disagreement because I think that that's where we need to go as it was embedded in a lot of the things that I've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we so appreciate your time, Gene, Dr. Beresin,
Yeah,
in your expertise. I think, again, as you've given us a lot to think about, and so thank you so much for your time and your perspective.
you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right, Ricky, I don't even know where to start. As I repeatedly said to Dr. Beresin at the end of that interview, I just feel like he gave us so much to think about. And there's just, as he was talking, like he would talk and I'd be like, oh yeah, I want to build off that. And then he would keep talking, like, no, no, I want to talk about that. So I hope, again, that people out there listening found that interesting and valuable. I certainly did. I guess, again, not knowing where to start, but one thing I thought was really interesting was when he started talking societally. And what I was thinking about was like there's kind of a line going both ways, where our younger people are growing up and they're not engaging with people in social settings. They're not engaging with people who are different than them, whether that's socioeconomically or gender wise or race wise or just thought wise. And so then you grow up and you enter the society and you don't have all of the skills to be a social person like we would ideally want in our society. But also, so like that's the line going up as you get older. But also there's a line coming back down where young people today are looking at our leaders and our role models in our society, and they seem to be lacking those skills. And so what do you have is like if those are the people that you're seeing exhibit these almost antisocial behaviors, that's who you're going to model yourself after. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an interesting thing to sort of think about in terms of who do they have or who do they see versus who did we see growing up. I think one of the other aspects of this that feels so challenging as a new parent is that like this like delicate balance of everything
Such a
that you
balance.
were
Yeah.
yeah mentioning. Like, we grew up super busy, but even in our busyness we always had the 15 minutes of stretching before practice is just you and the boys just saying all kinds of nonsense, and then the walking in the hall between classes and the free periods, right? Like, that's a lot of where, or what, messing around in the canteen is where a lot of those relationships were really forged. And even though they were kind of around our activities, I think he was almost right to point out that like during the activities themselves, you're not really making those relationships. It's the buses, it's those in between times that you really find ways to connect to other people. And I think one of the other things that I hadn't really considered, because something that keeps coming up in a lot of this like parenting stuff that I'm now very attuned to, is this idea that, the American lifestyle, this hyper individualistic, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality, does often lead to, or at least the way that it's prescribed leads to this kind of isolation, or described leads to uh, an an isolated existence in some ways, or it can. And this was juxtaposed with, a lot of, my family obviously from India, where the way my parents grew up, or my dad especially grew up in a house where it was his parents, but also like 4 or 5 aunts and uncles and grandparents and all this stuff. But I think, to Dr. Beresin's point, that there can be loneliness in these moments too, or in these environments as well. That poverty can breed loneliness, like so many different
Yeah.
avenues, that striving for these human connections is really an active um, pursuit. And that, I mean, it's one of the things that makes me so grateful that we get to do this, because we're always in contact in some way, and then we don't go long stretches without talking to each other. And I feel very grounded in who I am, because we get to have these types of discussions. And that's, as opposed to, the echo chambers of either social media, or even really within my own head, when I'm trying to digest or come up with ways to understand things. Of course I see them through my own lens, but when we get to talk about them, that's when all of a sudden, if I do it right, if I actively say Brendan's going to give me some information that I wouldn't have already had, or give me a new perspective, and that is going to help me really understand what I think I understand better. And I think so much of what we're trying to do is, I mean, obviously not, there's no sort of one solution, one size fits all, but I think it's something that really, I think, is helpful in this regard.
Agreed. and feel very lucky for a lot of different reasons, but certainly for you and that we get to do this. I think one of the things that Dr. Beresin said at one point, he was like, "What's happened to civility?" I was like, I know, I'm trying to bring it back. But it's also just building off what you said there is that this is active. And this is where I think Dr. Beresin's point was well taken and is something I'm going to continue to think about. Of the beauty always existed, and it's been exacerbated by so many modern factors, as he mentioned, many of them: social media, video games, a greater awareness of the world, the greater isolationism, the politics that we have, COVID. All of these things have kind of exacerbated issues that always exist in our society. But the fact that we're talking about them more is an important first step. And then the second step is being active about it. So like, this is obviously, you and I have chosen to engage in this kind of pursuit in this podcast, which is great. It's one small thing, but it's also like, he got me thinking about it. You have to be active in how you are raising your children, or how you are mentoring young people, or even in our own lives. Like, how are we interacting with our family members? How are we interacting with our friends? Are we being active to make sure that we're not being isolated and not getting into our own silo, and that our people in our own lives aren't falling by the wayside and feeling marginalized? Because I think, again, we focus so much on that, the Gen Z, the 12 to 26, but I think we're aware, certainly as we're getting older, whether it's with our older family members or even with people in our own generation, with our friends, is that like, everyone has different experiences, and things can be super hard. And it's important to be active in engaging other people and engaging in social interactions to hopefully ensure that people within our networks and our webs like don't feel that way.
Yeah. I think that's right. So here's some more of that.
Yeah, for sure. There's just so much. Ricky, whatever, we'll get offline. This episode's probably running a little bit long, but so much of the other stuff that he was saying, like this building resilience and how difficult that is for anybody to build, like those are hard but critical skills to have. And just that we don't talk in narratives anymore. Like, how often, Ricky, have we been like, oh, it seems like it's never been worse? And then he references like the 60s, or you can reference the 1860s, right? And it's like, oh, we've been through harder times before, and we've overcome those things. I really like that idea of narratives, and that's how I always try to teach history. But it's because it sticks more. It sticks more when you have narratives. Like,
Yeah.
you can point to things along the way, as opposed to just like isolating this moment as the end all be all. Whatever. The narrative that he was weaving felt like so much of what we had talked about in so many of our previous episodes, which I appreciated, and again has given me plenty of things to think about.
Yeah. As always, fodder for next time.
For sure. Again, huge thank you to Dr. Beresin for his time, his perspective, his expertise. We continue to feel so blessed that people like him give of their time and talent to us. For our listeners who always listen, as always, we appreciate you. If you're a new listener, you can follow us at _gentlemen's_disagreement on Instagram. Obviously, if you're listening to us, you know that we're available wherever you get your podcasts, and we hope you enjoyed.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be back, and until the next one. See you later.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.